is produced. Just as there are examples of this kind of superlative genius in the world, not directly connected with what we would call religion, or what in a secular context would just be framed as exceptional human ability, from another perspective is seen as a manifestation of spiritual power. And what this manifestation has to do with is the extent to which one is grasping those essential relationships that proceed from the realities of things. This ends up being quite a key phrase in the writings and talks of Abdu'l-Baha. And he returns to this phrase over and over throughout the years. The first time, I believe, is not even here in Some Answered Questions, which was around 1908 or 1909, but a couple of decades earlier in his treatise on politics, where he gives a similar definition, not to religion, but to the laws that govern society. We'll have to go, I think, one more slide. He says, these rules and relationships that constitute the basis of human happiness and that attend the descent of the divine favors. And he was describing the laws of, just the laws of the nation. He says, are none other than the divine law and the social order that ensure the felicity, the integrity, and the security of the human race. This law and order consist in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. You see that same phrase appearing. How could they otherwise bring order to the body politic or be conducive to the well-being and happiness of human society? So there's almost a subtle joining of what were before two categories, the idea of human law and divine law. And Abdu'l-Baha is saying, anything that we even identify as human law, if it's aligned with those essential realities, then it's divine. What makes it special, what makes it effective in the world, is the degree to which it aligns with the undergirding realities of things. That should not be a controversial statement, and that's how Abdu'l-Baha understands the law of society. And isn't it interesting, though, how he uses that same phrase to define religion? And this invites us into a different way of thinking about religion, complementary to a natural view of religion, a top-down way of looking at religion. One looks at the insight of the prophet as something which proceeds from their understandings of things. What they're saying is just they're stating the facts as they see them. And to us, we've never heard facts like these before, and we can't figure out how they got to the point that they got to. We can call that intuition, the deepest forms of intuition that far surpass those of others. If we go back a slide, we find that Abdu'l-Baha uses this same phrase in other astonishingly different contexts. So the first sentence we've already read, and the second one comes from a tablet he wrote to Dr. Farrell in 1919. So spanning the entirety of Abdu'l-Baha's life, from the 70s or 80s when he wrote the treatise on politics to 1919, the same phrase emerges throughout his thought. In his letter to Dr. Farrell, he says, by nature is meant those inherent properties and necessary relations derived from the realities of things. And although the English here is slightly different, if you go back to the Persian, it's exactly the same word-for-word phrase in the Persian as it is in the English. So the difference is only that of the translation. Okay, so religion and love. Nature, we're about to see love. This next quotation, he says, love is the cause of God's revelation unto man, the vital bond inherent in accordance with the divine creation in the realities of things. Again, we see the strong echo of that same phrase. So we have law, religion, love, nature. There's another one I haven't quoted where he defines fate and predestination. He uses precisely the same phrase. He says fate and predestination are the essential relationships proceeding from the realities of things. What is he trying to convey here? What are we supposed to get from this? These ideas which come from vastly different domains, nature, religion. Well, we already heard Baha'u'llah identify nature and the primal will. So I guess we shouldn't be entirely surprised to see Abdu'l-Baha give complementary definitions here. But he pulls in love itself, and he pulls in the laws of society. So we have an idea then of the nature of revelation and the nature of word as somehow deeply reflecting certain structures, certain existing realities, and by reflecting those realities accurately, to the degree that words can, they're also influential and formative in the world. So this brings us to the nature of the words themselves and the power, the strange and mystical power that these words have, which is so beyond the power of regular human speech. Let's go another slide or two. Let's see. And let's just step back for a moment and just realize just how amazing writing is, and how amazing books are. The fact that you can take a thought in someone's head and transmit that thought, teleport that thought across vast distances, across vast stretches of time, and somehow that thought can land in someone else's head. It's the deepest form of magic. It's deep magic. If there's anything magical in the world, it's this ability. Carl Sagan puts it in a wonderful way. He says, what an astonishing thing a book is. It's a flat object made from a tree with flexible parts on which are imprinted lots of funny dark squiggles. But one glance, and you're inside the mind of another person, perhaps someone dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, an author is speaking clearly and silently inside your head, directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people who never knew each other, citizens of distant epochs. Books break the shackles of time. A book is proof that humans are capable of working magic. But Sagan's description of the book is contrasted. He leaves out a bit of a problem about writing. And the problem I mentioned yesterday, and here's the quotation from Plato's Phaedrus that brings this problem into full view. The problem with books is that, and that differentiates them from speech, is that in everyday speech, when you're speaking to someone, you are speaking to someone. And it's a two-way thing. The choice of words you make is relative to the person you're in front of. And that's the way human relationships work. Words are not spoken out to the void. They're spoken to a particular audience. And once these words are put in the form of dark squiggles on a page made from a tree, they start getting passed around. Who knows who gets a hold of it? And the people who end up reading these words were not necessarily the audience that was intended. So the moment you put something on the page, you lose control over it. You've now lost, and you've lost half of the whole story of writing, of communication of speech is the person saying the words and the person receiving the words. So half the story is gone the moment you put it on the page, and this presents a major problem, as we'll discuss. So Plato puts it this way: once a theme is put in writing, the composition drifts all over the place, getting into the hands not only of those who understand it, but equally of those who have no business with it. It doesn't know how to address the right people and not address the wrong. Now, this wouldn't be such a big problem if, for instance, in, scientific writing, fiction writing, most of the kinds of writing people do, and they're addressing a particular audience, and that particular audience knows the context and can understand and interpret the words in the appropriate context. Here's the unique problem of religious writing, is that it's supposed to address everybody. Everybody, at all levels of understanding, from the highest degrees to the lowest degrees, from the most simple to the most complex and subtle. Everyone has to get something out of it. And so the prophet, when they write, when they reveal, surely knows that their audience is the entirety of humanity. How do you reach everybody simultaneously? How does a math teacher teach math to everyone simultaneously from kindergarten level to the college level? You can't stand up there in a lecture and say, okay, I'm going to give a math lecture, and your classroom is filled with people of all grades, what are you going to do? You can't teach math that way. It can't be done. How in the world can you teach spiritual things that way, given that you have people of all grades in your classroom, people of all kinds of understandings in the spiritual classroom that is the world of humanity? The prophet has to be able to speak in multiple modes or valences simultaneously. And that's an art, really, that only prophets seem to have mastered. When they say every word of God has 72 meanings, perhaps this is what is meant. There have to be 72 meanings. There's at least 72 different kinds of understandings out there that can capture those meanings. And it's not only that the words have to be addressed to many people, but the things that they're trying to express, the concepts that they're trying to express, are not so simple as mathematics, childishly simple as mathematics and calculus and so forth, which are actually, compared to these sorts of realities, are the simplest of things. They're expressing divine things, which Abdu'l-Baha says are too deep to be expressed by common words. The heavenly teachings are expressed in parable in order to be understood and preserved for ages to come. And these parables then have to somehow speak to all levels of understanding. So what results then is something of such mysterious potency, because it seems to attract everyone in a different way. The words have a power that sets them apart, as Baha'u'llah writes regarding this. He says, "No breeze can compare with the breezes of divine revelation, whilst the word which is uttered by God shineth and flasheth as the sun amidst the books of men." And elsewhere, he says, "The word which the one true God uttereth in this day, though that word be the most familiar and commonplace of terms, is invested with unique distinction." It's an interesting thing to think about, that every word that the prophet is using is in the dictionary. But how do you put them together in configurations that set it so far apart from other words that are delivered by others? It takes the ear to hear it. And certain people, George Townsend is an example of one of the early Baha'is, who heard this music. He was a member of the Anglican Church, I believe, or was he a Catholic? No, he was an Anglican. And he writes about this note that he heard, even in translation, he says, and the translations of the time were not the translations of the Guardian, but there were these very, as described in the preface to one of the early translations, it was a king in rags that you had access to at that point. And he says there's a note, a music, a voice in the writings of Baha'u'llah, even in translations, which never was heard in English literature before, and which has such power that it seems to shake the air as one reads. If other proof were lacking, this mighty voice would be proof enough. The power, this mighty power that shakes the air, has the power to reconfigure human social realities and thus reshape the world. Abdu'l-Baha says, "Not but the celestial potency of the Word of God, which ruleth and transcendeth the realities of all things, is capable of harmonizing the divergent thoughts, sentiments, ideas, and convictions of the children of men. Verily, it is the penetrating power in all things, the mover of souls, and the binder and regulator in the world of humanity." And this harmonization of thoughts and ideas that it brings about is not the harmonization of an enforced, of some sort of enforced consistency or an enforced unitary dogma. The harmonization it brings in the case of the Baha'i revelation is that which results from this expanded understanding of this three-dimensionality of the sacred word that simultaneously embraces these complementary perspectives of the East and the West. What else do we have here? the flip side of the power of the word is that it can be so bright, the shining can be so bright that it obscures itself. The challenge of the word sometimes is its own power and its own self. Baha'u'llah in the Seventh Valley says, how strange that while the beloved is visible as the sun, yet the heedless still hunt after tinsel and base metal. Yea, the intensity of his revelation hath covered him, and the fullness of his shining forth hath hidden him. And in this next slide, Baha'u'llah also says, in Gleanings, it hath been decreed by us that the word of God and all the potentialities thereof shall be manifested unto men in strict conformity with such conditions as have been foreordained by him who is the all-knowing, the all-wise. We have moreover ordained that its veil of concealment be none other except its own self. And part of what simultaneously conceals it and also makes it accessible to a variety, to people of all walks of life, is the fact that it is delivered in various kinds of languages. And Baha'u'llah references this at the end of Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. He says at one time, or at the beginning of the tablet, he says, at one time we spoke in the language of the lawgiver, at another in that of the truth seeker and the mystic. And yet our supreme purpose and highest wish hath always been to disclose the glory and sublimity of this station of love and harmony. This word, he says elsewhere, is the master key for the whole world, inasmuch as through its potency, the doors of the hearts of men, which in reality are the doors of heaven, are unlocked. The effect of this word in the world, and the real litmus test of whether it is true or not, isn't so much whether people are moved by it, because people are also moved by poetry. They're moved by the plays of Shakespeare. They're moved by all sorts of powerful expressions of the human spirit. But what distinguishes this word from others is its power to reshape human behavior, to reshape human consciousness, and to transform it and to elevate it. And Baha'u'llah says this towards the end of his book of Certitude, that is not the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind, a transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. For if the character of mankind be not changed, the futility of God's universal manifestation would be apparent. Our true litmus test of the truth of this is this test of transformation. Are we transformed by this? And can we see this transformation within our own community? And can others see it looking in from the outside, so to speak? Now, another aspect of this, of what has to make the word work, is this is a very experimental quotation, but it has to motivate us. It has to not only convey ideas, but it has to make those ideas so compelling to us that we want to change our lives and mold our lives around them. And I wanted to compare and contrast two quotations from two very different sources that seem to me to be describing very, very kind of similarly a big picture story about the world. One of these motivates and transforms, but the other doesn't. And so I want to invite you to sort of think about what the reasons are. That eloquent words themselves are not always sufficient as a basis for that motive power that has to transform human behavior. So here's one example. And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flood of its forms, out of the simplest forms striving toward the most complex, out of the stillest, most rigid, coldest forms, striving toward the hottest, most turbulent, most self-contradictory, and then again returning home to the simple out of this abundance, out of the play of contradictions back to the joy of concord, still affirming itself in this uniformity of its courses and its years, blessing itself as that which must return eternally, as a becoming that knows no satiety, no disgust, no weariness, without goal, unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will, unless a ring feels goodwill toward itself. Do you want a name for this world? This world is the will to power and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. It's a very eloquent and poetic description of what one might call a version of the circle of existence, a version of the idea of the universe continually reconfiguring itself as it strives towards life and abundance and will and perhaps consciousness. But who's the author of this? The infamous declarer of the death of God and perhaps the architect of the primary architect of the nihilistic worldview that informs the current certain sectors in the current age. Incredible talent, to describe things, and in some way even appropriating some of the language and cadences of sacred scripture to try to get his idea across. Does this philosophy transform human character and elevate it? Where does it lead humanity? And what differentiates it from the next slide? Here's another way of describing something which sounds a little bit similar. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. This vision of the universe is, of alternating love and hate, without giving a vision of some larger purpose behind things. One can see that sort of similarity. But here this is from Ecclesiastes. This is from the Old Testament. How is this, how are these words how do they touch us more deeply than the words of the secular philosopher? What is it about the words, even if they're describing something very similar, that gives them the, let's say, the aura of the numinous? I'll leave you with that question because I'm not sure what the answer is. But to me, one of them sings in a sort of musical tone, and the other is beautiful, but it stops at the external beauty, at the level of poetry. So let's progress forward. So we were looking at the nature of the manifestation, the nature of the word and its power, and of course what is born from this historical event of the appearance of a prophet in the world, of the leaving behind a body of work which has this transformative power, is the faith community that emerges around this word, the religions of God that are inspired by the transformative power of these words. And in the Baha'i writings also, just as we have it's somewhat challenging redefinitions and new ways of thinking about traditional categories like God and spirit and the prophet and nature and so forth, we also have a new way of looking at the phenomenon of religion itself, a redefinition of religion itself, which in some way is very challenging because it's a little bit counterintuitive. Baha'u'llah in the Kitabi Aqdas writes, "With faces beaming with joy, hasten ye unto him. This is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future." What changes more than religion, though? When one looks at the evolution of religion throughout the ages and the vast differences in theologies and practices between religions of the East and West, how can one claim that it's changeless, eternal in the past, eternal in the future? What is that changeless element? Fortunately, Baha'u'llah has identified for us the changeless element, and there really is only one. Says everything else changes. There's one changeless element, but that's enough to, because it's the core element, that's enough to characterize the whole. He says, "Know thou that in every age and cycle, all laws and ordinances have been changed according to the requirements of the times, except the law of love, which like a fountain ever flows, and whose course never suffers change." The law of love, we know, is not just the law of love between one human soul and another, but the law of love is it's a universal force. There's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha called the Tablet of Love, which is published in its entirety in Selections from the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, I think number 10 or number 12, towards the beginning of that volume. And it begins, "Know thou that love is the secret of God's holy dispensation." And it describes in very beautiful terms all these different manifestations of love. And among them, he lists the movement of the stars, the movement of the planets in their orbits. Here we go. Number 12. He says, "Love is the vital bond inherent in accordance with the divine creation in the realities of things." A vital bond. Love is the unique power that bindeth together the diverse elements of this material world. The supreme magnetic force that directeth the movements of the spheres and the celestial realms. He's talking about gravity. He's talking about electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, all the forces that are described so well by mathematical equations in the realm of physics. Abdu'l-Baha says this is love. And how is it love? It's through, what does love do? Love brings into being higher degrees of consciousness. Love unites things, and in uniting things, it produces something which was not there before, which has capacities which were not realized before. In that sense, it's the love of hydrogen atoms for each other as they join to form helium atoms in the hearts of stars that causes the stars to shine. You can also call it fusion. Yes, it's also fusion, and that's what powers the hearts of stars. But in the next slide, that might give us a different way of thinking about this quotation, this famous quotation by Baha'u'llah. "The utterance of God is a lamp whose light is these words, Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye one with another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship. He who is the day star of truth beareth me witness. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth." Well, the power of the light of unity can illuminate the earth in more than one way. The light of unity, which is the light that powers the sun, is also the light which illumines the earth. Maybe one example of this principle of symmetry between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Certain repeated patterns are found at the elemental level that are seen also at much higher levels of organization. The power of love as it is enacted throughout creation in the gradual upbuilding of matter from the elementary level in the formation of stars and planets to the emergence of simple celled organisms in the ancient seas to the evolution of more complex beings that ultimately end with the emergence of the human form and all its complexity. All of this can be seen as ever higher and higher expressions of the force of love. And once the human being is created, then still higher levels of the force of love await as humans unite in ever larger configurations, from the family to the tribe to the city-state, finally to this point in this signal moment, this transitional moment in the history of human civilization, when our civilization, the structures of our society for the first time extend around the globe, enabling, although not yet realized on the planet, but enabling potentially expressions of the power of love that we have yet to experience in this world. So all of this is affected through a way of thinking about religion which cannot be the same as it was before. It cannot be the same sort of tribalistic competition for members where one religion's theologies and dogmas are completely exclusive of another religion's theologies and dogmas. It requires a way of thinking about the religious experience, as Baha'u'llah invites us in the Kitabi Akdas, saying that this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. It invites us to thinking about religions not as competing sects, but rather as all coherent and ultimately complementary ways of approaching the divine with a common purpose connected to this idea of the fountain of love that Baha'u'llah speaks of. In One Common Faith, the House of Justice says, Baha'u'llah is not brought into existence. I shouldn't say the House of Justice. It was a statement commissioned by the House of Justice, which is a distinction that we should retain. But it says in that statement, Baha'u'llah has not brought into existence a new religion to stand beside the present multiplicity of sectarian organizations. Rather has he recast the whole conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. That's really a major redefinition of the thing. Right? To think of religion as a principal force impelling the development of consciousness, now it puts us in a whole different space about this. And it gives us a different set of litmus tests to think about what differentiates true religion from false religion. Well, what tends to upbuild consciousness? What tends to broaden rather than narrow the field of our view in the world? What tends to make us more and more aware of and concerned for the suffering of others? What tends to expand the love for our neighbors, and what tends to contract that around certain tribalistic forms? It gives us a very practical and pragmatic way of looking at religion. And the idea that religion is not just some sort of tribe apart from other tribes, some sort of competing self-organization, with its own structure and clergy and do's and don'ts, that doesn't intersect others. It's not unique to Baha'u'llah's writings, but other cultures and societies have very different ways of thinking about religion than in the West, particularly in the Christian West. An example of this is the Navajo. The Navajos have no word or phrase in their language which could possibly be translated as religion. Religion is not a separate entity to be believed in or subscribed to. It is ever present. Religious rites and practices are an essential element of Navajo culture, pervading it to such an extent that, paradoxical as it may seem, it was several decades before white Americans living among the Navajo realized they possessed any form of worship at all. It can be so different that we don't even label it, or we assign it the wrong label. Abdu'l-Baha has some challenging things that sometimes have been quoted out of context, but it's worth quoting them, I think, in the fuller context of what the central figures of the faith have said about religion. And this is one of those statements. He says, the Baha'i message is a call to religious unity and not an invitation to a new religion, not a new path to immortality, God forbid. It is the ancient path, cleared of the debris of imaginations and superstitions of men, of the debris of strife and misunderstanding, and is again made a clear path to the sincere seeker, that he may enter therein in assurance, and find that the word of God is one word, though the speakers were many. And in emphasizing this, I think if one stopped here, of course, one would not get the totality of the right idea about it, because at the same time, the faith of Baha'u'llah that Abdu'l-Baha was the exponent of does have members. It does have organization, very clearly defined organization. It does have a plan for enacting itself in the world and a plan for organizing the world. And in that sense, it's not just a sort of this nebulous idea of world unity. So Abdu'l-Baha here in this particular place is emphasizing one aspect of it. But you find that Shoghi Effendi does the same thing, and this is in one of his central letters, the World Order letters of Baha'u'llah. Listen to the Guardian himself say the Baha'i faith is not really a religion the way we've thought about it. He says, refusing to be labeled as a mere philosophy of life, or as an eclectic code of ethical conduct, or even as a new religion, the faith of Baha'u'llah is now visibly succeeding in demonstrating its claim and title, and then he uses the word religion, to be regarded as a world religion, so he must mean this in some different sense, destined to attain in the fullness of time the status of a world-embracing commonwealth. Far from wishing to add to the number of the religious systems whose conflicting loyalties have for so many generations disturbed the peace of mankind, this faith is instilling into each of its adherents a new love for and a genuine appreciation of the unity underlying the various religions represented within its pale. It's a different way of looking at the faith, really, as this umbrella that includes religions within its pale, and the members of which now have a broader understanding of the purpose and the origins and purpose and goals of their former faiths. And in joining this new faith, it's not walking away from this tradition and joining this other tradition. It's a different sort of an idea. It's a realization that the tradition within which one was previously born or practiced was, whether one realized it or not, a part of this larger circle of the changeless faith of God. I think Shoghi Effendi says this in other words in another very important statement he made to the Special UN Committee on Palestine in 1947. He said, this faith is now increasingly demonstrating its right to be recognized, not as one more religious system superimposed on the conflicting creeds which for so many generations have divided mankind and darkened its fortunes, but rather as a restatement of the eternal verities underlying all the religions of the past. You get a sense where that statement from one common faith came from. It seemed to have been inspired by some of these statements by Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. So this takes us to another set of ideas, and this is going to be my attempt to put everything together. And how does one put everything together? What is a way of looking at the interconnectedness of all things? If we start from this idea of Abdu'l-Baha that we just looked at the start, where he defines religion as the essential relationships proceeding from the realities of things. So take that as our starting point. Everything is all interconnected, but it's not just the interconnection of, bubbles in a foam, where there's no difference between one bubble and another. Things are connected in a, you could say, hierarchical sense. There's higher and lower degrees of things. There's, Abdu'l-Baha talks about kingdoms of existence, so the mineral and the vegetable and the animal and the human. So there is kind of a higher and a lower in a sense, if you want to define higher and lower as in a new kind of axial age, where the axis now is the axis of consciousness, and higher would be higher consciousness, and lower would be lower degree of consciousness. Even a rock, in that sense, has consciousness, quote unquote. The consciousness of the rock is the fact that it responds to the law of gravity. At the lowest levels, consciousness is the interaction of an object within its environment according to certain laws. That there's a connection between things. If something happens and something else happens. At the basic level, consciousness is response to some sort of stimuli. And you can think of that as being the lowest level of consciousness in the physical world, in the mineral world. Of course, that doesn't map directly onto our intuition about the idea of consciousness, which we'd like to think is our exclusive domain, perhaps, as human beings, which maybe bleeds a little bit down to maybe dogs and cats. But when it gets to snails and things, we're not so sure anymore if there's a consciousness. But if we want to define consciousness as maybe suggested by this definition of religion that's proposed in One Common Faith, that Baha'u'llah has brought about this redefinition of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness, it is something which can be seen as all-embracing. It's embracing all different domains of life. This isn't just the human world that we're talking about, but the faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future, is also eternal in space and time. It's the laws of physics themselves are part of the faith of God in that sense. The law of evolution that brought, and the forces of natural selection and so forth that brought, the human being and formed the human being on this planet over billions of years is also part of that. Is also part of that plan of the divine. And the ultimate thing that makes that plan coherent is consciousness. Why consciousness? It goes back to the divine self-remembrance that we were talking about earlier. You have to start with some metaphor. You got to start somewhere. The starting point of this metaphor is the divine self-reflection. The starting point of the metaphor is something approximating a circle. It's consciousness reflecting upon itself. Its self-knowledge is our starting metaphor. It's God's love for His own essence, which, as a starting point, you can think of worse starting points, because it does force you to already we're already having used the words to say it. We're already locked into perhaps some wrong concepts, because where does God come from, and why does He love Himself so much, and so it invites us into kind of anthropomorphic, musings about it. But let's start from that point of God's knowledge for self. And the slide here that you're looking at, by the way, is what you might call an early take on this idea, which is something called the chain of being, or the great chain of being, which is a very popular idea in the Renaissance. And it's an idea that shares something with this idea that I'm describing, but is significantly different in a couple of respects. In the great chain of being, all life is intimately connected. And in the great chain of being also, there's an axis. There's a higher and a lower. But the thing about the great chain of being, as defined during the Renaissance and forward, is first of all, it's a static hierarchy. And it tended to be used to justify certain power structures and the superiority of certain people over other people. And so there's a way that in which introducing the idea of a higher and a lower, the idea of a hierarchy, if it's not made dynamic and fluid, can be used as a tool of oppression. So like any sharp sword, religion is a very sharp sword. It can be used to cut in both directions. And ideas have to be very, I think, carefully situated and explained so that they're not misunderstood. And so I introduce this idea of the great chain of being first as a warning, I suppose, that one can describe this in a way that might seem to justify certain unjust hierarchies in the world. But the chain of being that Abdu'l-Baha talks about, if we look at the next slide, and he talks about this chain of being quite a lot. But the chain of being he's talking about is quite different. He says in some answer questions, all beings are linked together like a chain, and mutual aid, assistance, and interaction are among their intrinsic properties and are the cause of their formation, development, and growth. And I might have one or two quotes on this chain of being. He says, the chain of creation is interwoven in one universal law and divine order. Everything is interlinked. a link cannot be broken without affecting that universal order. Everything that happens is according to the exigencies of this order and is based on consummate wisdom. We might have another one after this. Yes, this material world has an outward appearance as it has also an inner reality. All created things are interlinked in a chain leading to spirituality and ultimately ending in abstract realities. So the chain, though, is not a linear chain that just goes from point A to point B. It's a chain that has the same starting point as ending point. And the new axis if the axial age of 2 millennia ago, with the upper and lower story, remains in this concept of the chain of being, that axis has now been bent around into a circle, which comprises this chain of being, which has its origin point and its ending point in what Plotinus would call the One, and what the Baha'i writings would call the primal will. Abdu'l-Baha describes perhaps the central and most important place for Abdu'l-Baha describes this key idea in his thinking, which is really an extension of an ancient idea from at least the time of Plotinus onwards, and which is towards the end of Some Answered Questions, is where he says that those who have thoroughly investigated the questions of divinity know of a certainty that the material worlds terminate at the end of the arc of descent, that the station of man lies at the end of the arc of descent and the beginning of the arc of ascent, which is opposite the supreme center, and that from the beginning to the end of the arc of ascent, the degrees of progress are of a spiritual nature. The arc of descent ends in material realities and the arc of ascent in spiritual realities. The point of the compass in describing a circle does not reverse its motion, for this would be contrary to the natural movement and the divine order and would disrupt the regularity of the circle. So this is I think a seminal quotation and a seminal chapter in Some Answered Questions, because it offers us the beginnings of a new kind of overarching narrative that encompasses all of the narratives that came before. The overarching, although he doesn't bring in the idea of consciousness, that gets brought in other places. You know, what that circle is, what that circle represents, you know, from very ancient times, that circle has been conceived, the circle of existence has been related in the image of the snake swallowing its own tail, which was adopted by the medieval alchemists and the ancient alchemists as a symbol of the rebirth, which the philosopher's stone is supposed to catalyze. It's supposed to catalyze the transmutation of lower elements into gold. And in the spiritual realm, that alchemical process is enacted through the completion of this circle of existence, which even in this diagram has a light half and a dark half. It's almost as though the arcs of ascent and descent are represented here, perhaps accidentally. But another graphical description of the circle of existence can be found in the mansion of Baji, Baha'u'llah's mansion in the north of Akka in Israel. In the upper floor of the mansion of Baji, across from his room, for those who have perhaps visited this holy place during a Baha'i pilgrimage or visit, they might notice in a corner of the room of Mirza Abul Fazl, this is hanging on the wall, and it's a representation of the circle of existence that was done by, I think it was done by May Maxwell, or it was done on the basis of words of Abdu'l-Baha to May Maxwell, if I'm not mistaken. It can be found on the internet if you poke around enough. And it comes with a whole text that describes the circle of existence. And you see the arc of descent on the left-hand side with the different stages of the mineral and the vegetable and the animal. You see the human degree at the bottom of the arc of descent, which contains within it the potentiality of all the stages to follow, the spiritual stages. And those spiritual stages, what we call all the worlds of God, the infinite worlds of God to which are really realms of consciousness, to which, within which, or which humanity has the potential of attaining. Those comprise the arc of ascent. And at the top is the Word, the infinite, the unknowable, or God. It's the thing that from which all things proceed and to which all things turn. It's the epitome of the burial ring that is, and the words inscribed on the burial ring, that I came forth from God and return unto Him. That's the brief capitulation of the whole story, of there being a circle of existence. And what the circle represents is consciousness coming to know itself. Consciousness itself, which is the primal will, which is the primal intellect, which is the principle of the logos. All these ideas as incarnated, most fully in the person of the manifestation, which is that origin point and ending point of the circle of existence. So let's see. That is another way of putting this, and various philosophers and thinkers have put this in such simple terms that I wish Baha'u'llah had said this, but it'll have to be Carl Sagan. He said, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And, of course, the cosmos knowing itself is the same as God knowing himself, because he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. There's another very similar statement in Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel. It says, each of our lives is a part of the lengthy process of the universe gradually waking up and becoming aware of itself. I wish Baha'u'llah said that too. But I think he said something equivalent, but you have to put together all the pieces to get to this very simply put message. Yes, in the back? Is there? Please do. Thank you. That's beautiful. That's exactly, that's the exact counterpart, I think, of these statements here. Made in a purely secular context, but I think intuiting something about that big picture. And that big picture of the universe waking up and becoming aware of itself is perfectly represented in the perfect geometric form of the circle, where the consciousness sort of bends backward and reflects upon its own reality. Now, the imagery of the circle of existence is such a rich imagery, and the imagery of stages around this circle it enables us to extract so many useful explanations from. Only one of which is an idea which can change the way we think about dualism, about the separability of spirit and matter, as we talked about at greater length earlier. And this here is the quotation that inspired that conversation, where Abdu'l-Baha talks about the relativity of spirit and matter to what station you are in. He says, the deniers ask in their disbelief, where is that world? For that which has no actual material existence is sheer imagination. But the truth is that the world of existence is a single world, although its stations are manifold in accordance with the manifold realities of things. For instance, the world of mineral, plant, and animal existence is the same world. Despite this, the animal world, in relation to the world of the vegetable, is a spiritual reality and another world and abode. And this spiritual world and phenomenal world have, as we've discussed before, a kind of a mirror relationship to each other. as intimated, first of all, by Plato so many years ago, and by the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, and also in so many different ways in the Baha'i writings. Here, Abdu'l-Baha says the spiritual world is like unto the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. Whatever objects appear in this world of existence are the outer pictures of the world of heaven. And the idea of correspondence, though, and this is a great quote, because it extends the idea of correspondence beyond just A corresponds to B. You know, it goes beyond the idea of there's the appearance and there's a reality, but it extends it to the idea that there is almost an infinite succession of correspondences. And this is from a tablet of Baha'u'llah. He says, "Know thou that whatsoever can be found in this mortal world, this realm of limitation, every name and description, every form and attribute that can be seen or heard, hath in each world of the worlds of God manifestations and appearances corresponding to and befitting that world, and appearing with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute." So in each of the worlds of God, there's a reflection of certain, let's say, archetypes. You know, Platonic ideals or Platonic forms are not just mirrored once in this realm, but there's a principle of successive duplications in some way, all the way up and down the circle of existence. You know, at each degree, there's some corresponding reality. A good concrete example of this is the example of education that I gave before. You can talk about education in different realms of existence, and we have different words for it. So, you know, in the mineral realm, you can talk about, you know, the mineralization of things, or you can talk about, you know, the forces of the pressure that produces diamonds. In the vegetable realm, you can talk about cultivation. In the animal realm, you can talk about domestication, and in the human realm, education. In the spiritual realm, you know, transformation. You know, spiritual transformation. There's an archetypal process of elevation from one degree of consciousness to another degree of consciousness, which is repeated at each level of this circle of existence. And Baha'u'llah seems to affirm that. And the movement of the circle, and another thing which significantly distinguishes this circle of existence from the static chain of being of centuries ago, is the idea that it's continually in motion. Everything is continually proceeding from and returning to. All things are, all the way down to the elemental level, as we know from science, in a continual state of motion. And that motion is not just random motion, but it's motion in this direction. There's a directedness to it. There's a new axis in this, let's say, new axial age, in this late stage of the greater enlightenment, which recasts progress as a real thing, as something which ultimately is described as the expression of spirit in the world of matter. So one of the conclusions of this is that there can be and is no contradiction between true religion and true science. When a religion is opposed to science, it becomes mere superstition. The true principles of all religions are in conformity with the teachings of science. What this imagery and this new metaphor of creation has allowed us to do is it's allowed us to take what was previously a contradictory model of there being opposing, almost invisible spiritual forces that affect matter, and other sets of material forces that are described in everyday terms. And instead of modeling reality in these sorts of contradictory terms, it provides us a model of reality in which there is only one world, there is only one network of causality. And from a certain point of view, we identify those causal forces in spiritual terms, and we use the spiritual language and powerful imagery and metaphors and allegories and parables of religious traditions, which convey, according to one pole of our sphere of human thought, one way of conveying certain deep truths, which perhaps it can be alternatively conveyed in some cases on the opposite pole through the language of science and reason. So I think we're at a stopping point now to break and come back and maybe have a nice Q&A session. But I'm getting close to the end of what I'd prepared to present on, so I'm running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. So we'll have a lot of time after the break for conversation. Thank you.
Just a quick comment, dear friends. Just in case there's anybody who's planning to leave right now, and I certainly hope you're not planning to leave, the evaluation basket is back here. If you'll put your name tags in the box that is next to it. Please go now and have some refreshments that will sustain you through the next hour and 15 minutes. We have a 15-minute break.
All right, shall we get started? So I'm pretty much at the end, but I wanted to leave you with one or two more lovely quotations and thoughts about all of this. So we started from chaos, and hopefully we ended with order. From the chaos of the present to trying to imagine why we're at where we're at and where we're going collectively. I, let's say, intentionally omitted many of the messier details of how one actually does this in the world. How does this translate into what you actually do? Once you walk out the door, and what's your next action? But I would say it has something to do probably with study circles and devotional gatherings, junior youth groups, and all the things that we're doing which are building up the kind of open boundaried community which we know is the religious community of the future, one that is concerned with the spiritualization of our neighborhoods, and not just with a reinforcing a sort of the kinds of religious identities that have defined past denominations. The imagery of the circle of existence and the circle of consciousness is that we're left with is a unifying framework within which we can at least in theory understand and reconcile what otherwise would be completely unreconcilable. The chasm between fundamentally different theologies, for example, between the different religious systems of the world, and different spiritual traditions, I think can be seen within the context of this image and the other concepts that we were exploring today, as relative manifestations of a truth that has many facets and that is not an infinite number of facets, but many facets, some of which are complementary, in that deep sense that Niels Bohr talks about. The opposite truths, the deepest truths are such that their opposites are also true, which cannot be used in a lazy sense to sort of slip anything you want in, slip any manner of imagination and falsehood in and say, well, just because it's totally contrary to this other truth, it's true also. One has to treat these sorts of concepts with subtlety and wisdom. One thing that does emerge from this, though, is a clear picture of the unity of all things. That ultimately we're not talking about two different realities that are at times interacting with each other and at times going their own separate way. We're talking about one reality, a single reality which can be viewed under different aspects. The aspect of science and reason and rational laws which Abdu'l-Baha assures us in the opening chapter of Some Answered Questions, that's how the universe works, according to laws from which it will never depart, in chapter 1 of Some Answered Questions. And it can be seen under the aspect simultaneously in a complementary way, as an expression of the will of God to be known, to such a pervasive extent that every atom reflects this will, and every leaf that falls from every tree is doing so at the behest of a higher purpose. Both of these visions and ways of modeling reality, each in their own approximate way, producing some tangible benefit to the human race, are part of one overarching, unified system. As Baha'u'llah explains in one of his tablets, there is but one reality and one essence that is expounded in the worlds of outer form, and in each of its stages is described by a specific name in accordance with the degrees of its particular manifestations on the plane of this limited world. And that just recapitulates a similar quotation that we saw earlier. And another one following that. This is from Shoghi Effendi. He says, the essence of existence is a spiritual reality because invisible forces of the spirit are the origin of matter and the foundation thereof. That's a wonderful quotation to pair with that statement by Abdu'l-Baha about progress being an expression of spirit in the realm of matter. And this is, again, one lens through which you can look at the world. You can say, well, in the end, it's all spirit. The materialist would say, well, in the end, it's all matter. Depending on your perspective, you can describe the world from one perspective or the other. The question is, where are you trying to get to? What are you trying to produce in the world? So what I would like to do in the time remaining is to open up the conversation, because we didn't really have any discussion in the last session. And open the conversation to thoughts, especially concerns. And I say this because, having presented variations of this idea in a number of different countries now over the last few years, all to Baha'i audiences, I'm hoping for critical feedback that can help address any failures, and of which I'm sure there are many, and address gaping holes, of which I'm sure also there are many, or even contradictions that seem irresolvable within the framework that I'm suggesting. So happy to entertain any thoughts or concerns about this, or any other feedback or questions.
Do you think there's a place for a priori arguments, ones that do not start with the writings, but are just logical developments? To some extent, that's used by Mirza Abul Fazl in talking about the proofs of divine origin, or proofs of divine origin of the different religions, or proofs of the eternity of the soul, and so forth, that don't start with the writings, but start with just very basic assumptions that presumably everybody can agree on.
I do think there's a place for multiple discourses within this overarching framework. It's difficult to find any discourse, though, that starts with purely a priori. I mean, even science starts from a huge assumption that there is regularity in nature out there to be discovered, which is a massive assumption, and so you have to start somewhere, wherever you are. I'm suggesting we start with the circle, that's sort of, or starting with that statement by Thomas Nagel. It's a great starting point. That we individually are all parts of the universe slowly waking up into consciousness of itself. I like that as a starting point because it doesn't it doesn't necessarily, ring of some kind of theological supposition. And what I'm looking for are entry points into a world of ideas and thinking, which ultimately can be attractive to people of all religions, as well as people of no religion. And that's a difficult challenge to set oneself up for, because of the nature of the assumptions that any kind of dialogue has to start with. But the starting point of this particular conversation is ultimately consciousness, the existence of consciousness, and the suspicion that the consciousness is not here accidentally, but that it's somehow evolving or emerging from deeper structures of things. Yes.
Okay, use of the word axial to me brings in mind a car axis with two wheels on both sides. It doesn't mean to me anything that you seem to be talking about. Can you use another word to represent that?
The word axis here is supposed to evoke the idea of verticality, let's say. Another way to put it in... Well, I don't want to use the word hierarchy because it has a lot of negative connotations, and connotations of power dynamics and of a sort of static nature that I want to move away from. But an ancient imagery that's often used is that of the world tree. That there's this tree of life. We could call it the Sadratul Muntaha, the Baha'i phrase of the tree beyond which there's no passing. But that imagery goes way back into prehistory. The idea of something that's fixed in the ground and that grows up towards the sky, and that gives us a fundamental orientation. So the word, well, an axis is the thing around which everything revolves, and it defines a direction. An axis is not just things rotating around, but it also defines, it defines a particular direction and not some other direction. And it's a vector would be another sort of mathematical word. That might not help, but the Earth spins on its axis, and that defines where the North Pole is. Are there other words? Can people throw out other words that might be more accessible? The ladder, the cosmic ladder, the ladder of creation. Plato invokes the idea of a ladder, I believe, in the Symposium, where he talks about going rung by rung up the significances from understanding things at a very, let's say, granular level, or understanding the beauty of individual things, and then ascending that ladder until one understands the abstract beauty in itself and reaches the form. A ladder is another good imagery because it also implies that there's a lower and a higher, that you're using it to climb up somewhere. And it also is a good imagery because there's stages along the way. There's rungs along the ladder, just as there are rungs along the circle of existence. Yes. Yeah. That actually was going to be the starting slide yesterday, but I pulled it out at the last minute. I was going to quote pretty much most of Yeats' Second Coming, but I didn't. It's one of my favorite poems. You had too many slides already. Yes, in the back? Or, okay, we should pass the mic around, I guess. I won't.
You had kind of asked the question of where to from here when we're leaving here, and one of the things that hit me, it's kind of feedback, was in the Phoenix area, we've been developing this concept of spiritual cafes where basically we meet and have discussions, elevated discussions within a cafe type of environment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a perfect place for this. I can see presenting a lot of these ideas in a spiritual cafe.
Yeah.
I have three comments. One of them, the first one is, this was interesting to me, the universal consciousness raising. And in thinking about this in relation to social change, there's an element of it, it seems, that's also collective consciousness raising. So that if we're only talking about humanity, I mean, there's universal consciousness raising as well. But if we're talking about humanity or certain groups in within humanity, collective consciousness raising, how do we initiate that? How do we put that in place to achieve progress? The second comment, for some reason, circles work, but spirals also work. So we're talking about circles and ladders and progress, and so to me, spirals are cyclical. They have a cyclical pattern, but at the end of each cycle, they have, in some ways, a repetition, but also a renewal.
Yeah.
So that's a possible contribution. And then the third comment, I would have liked more engagement, more experiential engagement. And I wonder if there's a way to make this presentation connected with nature. We're in a nature environment. Excuse me, to take these concepts and connect them to the world around us, whether it's nature or an urban environment or something that really connects them using the rest of our input faculties so that the output can also then be diverse.
I love that idea, and it was I was contemplating, but ended up not doing it. Putting many of these quotations into little sort of thematic packets, and then having people go outside the building for a half hour at a time in small groups and discuss the quotations first, and maybe have a couple of guiding questions at the end of the packets, and then rotating through a bunch of packets that way, mixing up the groups and being in different places outside. I've done this before in deepening environments, and it was a very effective way for people to engage with the source texts before hearing them sort of thrown at you in a particular context and through a particular lens. And time was an issue, and how much time would it have taken away from the other parts? If I'd given myself more time to prepare, I probably should have done something like that. Because there's a difference between engaging this material on your own first and hearing it for the first time in a kind of a lecture format. You absorb it very differently. Yeah. Oh, you'll need the. Oh, okay.
I have two anecdotes. One goes to her point. Around Tucson, there's a place run by the University of Columbia. It's called Biosphere 2. And a few years ago, they had a terrible incident with the trees. They all split. And the scientists' conclusion was that they didn't have wind. The adversity of wind made them stronger, and they didn't have any wind inside the biosphere, therefore they weren't as strong. I thought that was a beautiful analogy to human beings and our adversity.
I love that.
That we have. That was just a wonderful little anecdote.
Wonderful.
Also, I would like to add something that's very common among the Sufis. Andreas Shaw is one of these people that compiled a lot of Sufi stories, and a very famous one is the one about the wise people going into this room that was foggy and dark, and they were asked to tell what was in it. And one said, "Oh, it's a snake. It's got this long tube." Another one said, "Oh, no, it's a big leafy thing. It's got this big piece. It's like this." Another one said, "Oh, it's a trunk of a tree." And they were all observing by touch an elephant. All different perspectives on what was in the room. And they use that as an analogy of we all have a different perspective about what we perceive as God, but it's all God. So I just thought
that's a great anecdote. Yeah.
But there's stories in every religion that has these anecdotes and parallels.
Yes.
Just like in the New Testament with Christ's
Yeah.
analogies. But I just thought
Thank
I'd add
you.
those two.
Yeah, this presentation is kind of begging for that analogy to be brought in at some point. Yeah, it's right down the middle. Yeah.
Oh, I was just hoping to understand the importance of the circle and its place in this conversation. I don't know if I got that at the end with the snake.
About what the importance of the circle is.
Yes.
To reiterate, why is this an important idea? Because it represents self-reflectivity, because it bends back on itself. And that's what consciousness does when it turns back and regards its own essence. So that's the simplest, maybe geometric way of describing self-knowledge. Describing the love of God for his own essence, describing that generative force that lies behind creation, which is not that it was a random event, but that it is it's here for the purpose of returning to itself. There's procession and return, and the circle also captures that idea of proceeding from and returning to.
So do you see the circle perceived as that in other cultures, like Native American, or how do other cultures?
Well, it's a powerful image, and it can certainly be used in other ways than designating a sort of a shorthand for a whole cosmology. You can also use it more simply as a way of designating the idea that all things are connected, or that everything sort of returns. You can use it to designate an idea of reincarnation, that everything sort of comes back in cycles that just endlessly repeat. So there are definitely other ways of using, this metaphor. But I think it is also the case that at least in some, ancient and less ancient traditions, the circle metaphor has been used in roughly the same way as I'm presenting it here.
Wait a minute. We have some other questions first, and then we'll get to you.
So when you talked about, and we've all read, that we're supposed to be able to look within ourselves and find God within our own being. But on the other hand, too, we're told that if we look at ourselves and see God there, that we are making a partner with God. So how do you, I know that's a complementary, must be a complementary aspect, but it's a tough one to reconcile.
Right. So what's the difference between joining partners with God? So taking the example of the Bob, who says if you pray to God as an object of worship, you've joined partners with God. You've set up some deity alongside the real thing. And one can do that certainly in the mode of worshiping some image outside oneself, and one can do it also from the mode of worshiping oneself in the wrong way. Worshiping one's lower self, holding up one's ego as the center of all things, as we know a lot of people do, and as is natural in some way for humans to do. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a subtle but very crucial distinction between holding one's self to be the center of existence, which is what this whole idea about the Enlightenment being successive removals from the center is supposed to get us out of that zone of thinking where we're the center of everything. But to go back then to say, oh, guess what, we are the center of everything, but not in the way we originally thought. The we, the us, the I that is the center of everything is not this I of the shell of our bodies that sloughs off and turns to dust. But the crucial question is, what is the I that remains? What is the thing that truly defines us? And we know it's not the ego, and we know it's not the body, and it has something to do with that eternal light that shines within. And in that sense, we still remain as the center. But it's a very different kind of centeredness than the centeredness at the level of the child, the ego-centered level of the child.
Hi, over here. You had said to somebody, or somebody said, and you said that you want to know what you might add or how there could be, she said, interaction and so forth. I would just like to put it out there that in the context of serving plans and meaningful conversations and science and religion and all these things, what I find so wonderful about what you do, the 2 times I've had the bounty of being able to listen, is that you pull everything together in these wonderful ways. And so I don't want to have a whole bunch of workshops listening to a bunch of people giving their views about quotations. I don't care what they think. I want to know what you think. So what I so what I would suggest, if you don't mind my suggestion, is that if you had, it's a lot of work, I know, but once it was done, it would be done, right? If you had some handouts that just had your key point as they went, with, if not all, then some of those wonderful quotations on those handouts, with the space for making notes, so that we could make notes not in a random, way that really isn't making notes, but related. Then, if at this point, if you can only do 2 days or whatever, then if there was a interactive time that you went around and listened to the groups, we would have those notes, you would have the quotes, and we'd have the points, and we could be refining how we could actually use this in conversations better, and or little deepenings, or to carry on what you've so wonderfully given us. That's what I would like.
Thank you. But the problem is I want to know what you think too. Because I can't improve on these ideas in a vacuum. And it requires critical feedback and pushback. And people say, well, what about this? And you left out this. And I really want that. I really need that. I think for this not to just become, for this to remain living and evolving and improving. But I take your point well. Thank you.
Stephen, hi. I was thinking one of the themes that came out of this is that a lot of this is giving us a new framework for exploring these ideas and communicating these ideas with people who maybe look at things from a different pole, right? And I was wondering if you could share any experience you've had in that, doing that in say like a scientific realm or something like that, with sharing some of these ideas with people, and what kind of response you've had, or just some experience you've had, if you know what I mean.
Well, for the last 3 years in my home, on most Sundays or every other Sunday or so, we have these we call them salons, because they're not firesides, they're not deepenings, they're just kind of discussions about these subjects, and a really wonderfully eclectic group of people has gathered around these Sunday morning salons to talk about these things from different perspectives. And I found that it's been attractive to, of course, to Baha'is, and to other members of other religious traditions, also who have come sometimes repeatedly and given sometimes extremely useful and sort of mind expanding feedback, both from the Christian tradition and the Taoist tradition and sometimes even atheistic traditions. So I'm finding, although I feel like my audience in this respect is fairly limited, but in let's say the test trials that I've made, it's gotten very positive feedback.
Okay, so a couple of things. First, on the idea of salons, years back, what some of the folks did in the Arizona area, most of them were not Baha'is, but we would watch, as a group, people would bring something, and then you would watch a thought-provoking movie in somebody's house. And then we would discuss, but I think you're suggesting have a topic. So I'd like to know how your salon runs,
Yes,
so maybe you can share
differently. Sometimes I bring a sheet of quotations. Sometimes in the Baha'i writings, sometimes from other things that I've been reading. Sometimes it has been revolved around the discussion of a particular book. Oftentimes it will be I think most of the time it'll be something that's thematic.
Okay. Thanks. The last thing I had to say was about love and God's love for himself and the 4 kinds of love, just from one perspective. Abdu'l-Baha does talk about what these loves are in Peristox, and he says, if you connect those to Baha'u'llah's love me that I may love thee, they kind of, I think, go together. But the one thing I wanted to add was also in the writings there's a reference to the sun, which you mentioned several times. And if the sun didn't have self-gravity, it would not be able to form. And in fact, the fusion that's happening is very intimately linked with the self-gravity of the sun. So therefore, I'm trying to say that's another analogy. It's amazing that a simple analogy in the writings, it can explain so many things.
Yep. It's the power of a good metaphor. But every metaphor fails at some point. However deep it is, however much you can unpack from it, there's always some point where it breaks down.
Yeah, in the writings, the Bab had been called the primal point. How does that relate to what you're talking about? Is that science, or is that a figurative religious term to describe?
Well, it's I think primarily used as an image of that simple reality that gives meaning to everything. It's the point in the Arabic and Persian script, the dots above and below the letters that differentiate one letter from the other. And so you can think of the point, the point has, in that sense, has a deeper resonance and meaning for Persian and Arabic speakers than it does for people who use Latin alphabets, for which the points are just pretty unnecessary embellishment. But in the case of Persian and Arabic, the point actually decides one letter from the other. And so it's the application of that point, and it's adornment of the words that bring meaning into the world. That's one of, I think, many layers in the sort of meaning of that phrase that the Bab also, often uses.
I think I mentioned this in a conversation briefly with you. I'm very curious, and perhaps some of the rest of us are very curious about you presenting this to scientists that are not Baha'is to see what their reaction would be, and share some of that with us at some future point when you come back here. As you go, as all the different audiences that you speak to, it'd be really interesting to find out what their response is. And I encourage you to do speak to a lot of scientists. It would be very, very interesting to see how they react and how they take all of this in, because it's so extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to have that opportunity. I think the next step at some point is putting this in writing in either a series of articles or a book or something. But I think the necessary prelude has been this sort of iterative process in more of an oral form. As Plato describes, when you know the audience, it's one thing, and once it's released onto the page, you lose control of it in some way. You don't know who's going to read it and how they'll take it. Although it's this, once it goes on YouTube, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
I was thinking about her comment about the circle and my study in music and dance therapy, and especially about the circle, how throughout hundreds of years in all cultures they dance in a circle. They move in a circle, and that whole process of feeling one in the circle, a part of the universe, and all that. And in dance therapy, they found that spinning in the circle it connects body, mind, and spirit. You know how children just spin and spin and spin. It's one of those experiences of reconnecting body, mind, and spirit, and being able to ground themselves and then gain a consciousness of how to express their spirit in the physical realm. So including the arts perhaps would be beneficial in your presentations.
Thank you.
I think you should make a board game out of it.
Thank you.
Actually, let me break in on that. Kurt, if you could go forward a bunch of slides. There's another, I had another representation of this creational circle. It might have been towards the end. So this is all the stuff I didn't have time for. But here we go, this one. So I tried to take, this might not be all that comprehensible to you because it brings up a whole lot of technical terminology from the Sufi traditions and from the traditions of Islamic philosophy, which are embedded within the Baha'i writings. And so you might recognize some and not recognize others. But the idea was to try to sort of take all of that terminology and show that there's a consistency in its application. And this is a sketch of the arc of descent and the arc of ascent. And you have for example, in red, the hadith of the hidden treasure, that I was a hidden treasure and loved to be known, therefore I brought creation to being that I might become known. So it kind of recapitulates that circle of existence. You have, what Baha'u'llah and the Kitab Yagan refers to as the most holy outpouring and the holy outpouring and the universal revelation, which are the three tiers of the ringstone symbol, which also map onto this idea of the circle of existence. You have, of course, the mineral and the vegetable and the animal and the human spirit. You have the spirit of faith and all the degrees of spiritual progress on the arc of ascent. What's not here, I think, are the four kinds of love. So that also ought to be put on this, and is missing. But it's an interesting exercise to try to look at and see if one can bring coherence to a number of complementary interpretive frameworks that have been used in the past, and see if they can be helpfully mapped onto the metaphor of a circle. But it really is an idea which I think potentially has legs. Has a lot of layers to it, and you can unpack a lot from it. So I broke in on someone.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking about something you said earlier, and I may be misquoting you or misquoting the Bob, who you were quoting at the time. But I think he said that as soon as you start treating yourself as an individual that's praying to an entity that is God, you are in fact joining partners with God. And I started thinking about the prayers of the Bob because I've always found them particularly reassuring. And I think I want to apply this to the prayers of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha as well, because it must work. But it just occurred to me that, just to take a simple example, think of the remover of difficulties. You're not asking for anything, and I may be wrong on this, but I understand the Baba actually revealed that for his wife as a source of comfort to her. But you're not actually asking for anything, you're just declaring the fact that God suffices, basically. God is important.
Yeah.
And he resolves difficulties, and you're not saying who he is. And I'm wondering if that's a good homework. Certainly is for me.
Yeah.
But for anyone else to start looking at the prayers and compare them with the prayers I make up myself, in which I'm definitely asking for something from someone. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of different ways I can think of to think about prayer. What is going on in prayer? And I'm sure there are others beyond this. But the first and most comfortable or common is conversation with God. You're face to face with a being. You are asking something, and you are getting an answer. So that's sort of framework one. And a separate framework which could be equally effective, depending on the person, depending on the situation. Can be thinking of prayer not so much as an interaction with another being, but as one is in a field. One is standing in a river. It's the current of life that's flowing through all things. It's the Holy Spirit, which is everywhere. But it's not just moving randomly. It's like the breeze of the merciful. It's blowing in a particular direction, and one can think of prayer as the act of opening one's heart to being sensitive to those spiritual currents and the direction that they're going, and aligning one's self and aligning one's actions and aligning one's consciousness in the direction of that current. And then when one acts, as one always should at the end of a prayer, one's action and then is in alignment with that current that runs through things. And being aligned with that current, your action is more effective because you're not swimming against it.
Okay, I'm not sure what I'm talking about whatsoever. Please take that into account. That when you mentioned this circle analogy, it just made me wonder about, Newtonian physics, lines are straight. It goes out in the universe forever and ever, a straight line. But then when you get to Einsteinian physics, everything's a circle and comes back on itself or something like that. Would that be a metaphor for something, somewhere, somehow?
Possibly.
I don't know. This concept with the curved space or something is totally incomprehensible to me. But when you mentioned that about the circle and the snake coming up with its tail, it just made me think of that, and I'm just wondering if it's related.
Not sure. I mean, I've used the metaphor of Newtonian versus Einsteinian gravity in a slightly different context. But you may be referring to things like field lines of a magnet, for example, that sometimes seem to go straight out from outer space, or the field lines of electric charge that just go out into infinity versus the field lines of a magnet that may go out a distance but end up curving back into a great arc. Is there a sort of some deep spiritual or metaphorical way that we can take the distinction between those two different kinds of field lines? I'm not sure. It's an interesting possibility.
It just hit me. I just don't understand it.
In that quotation about the one that was just referenced earlier, where the Bob says you're joining partners with God, I think it starts, "He who worshipeth God through anyone but Him," and it goes on.
Yes, yeah.
So at the first take, if you imagine that the word God in that sentence means the same thing as the word Him in that sentence, then it means you can't worship God.
Yeah.
But what if the word Him is referencing not the concept of God, but the manifestation of God, which is to say that maybe the Bob is simply saying that if you are praying, using the prayers of the manifestation and, centering your attention on the manifestation rather than on you as the prayer and God as the one being prayed to, if you always go through the manifestation, then you're good. But if you're not doing that, then that's where you're joining in partners. Is that another way to interpret that?
You could read it that way, but then you have to slip in. He would be changing the pronoun on you in midstream without giving you the new sort of referent, which isn't to say that isn't necessarily what he was saying, but it does require you to sort of add in an invisible referent to the pronoun, and he's suddenly changing from talking about God at some level to talking about the manifestation at another level.
Right, but there's quotations that talk about how the manifestation is God.
Right.
So.
Right, and in some sense the two are identical, but yeah. It's confusing because at what level can you talk about them as separate, and what level does it make sense to talk about them as the same thing? And if you talk about God and then refer to He right afterwards, can you switch that suddenly, and now you're actually talking about the manifestation and not God? But of course, the whole point of the Bobs is that you can't talk about God anyway. I mean, you can't sort of objectify God in any way. So I'm sure that doesn't answer the question, but it's
That actually kind of folds into my question, which actually, I love this picture if you want to know the truth. But I noticed that you have, either you can call them axes that are horizontal, or you can say that they're swaths. I wondered if kind of the bottom swath is kind of the realm of which we exist and potentially exist going forward, and that the next area is kind of like maybe somewhat more of that of the manifestation, and then the one that's above the circle completely, that's kind of where God is.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that middle dotted line really belongs there, but it tried to represent the idea that there's 3 stages. The quote that I read earlier about this is the primal veil, and above the primal veil is nothing but God, and below that veil everything is emanating from God. That primal veil is that upper dotted line. You can think of that as the middle dotted line. Now, just take this for what it's worth. It probably could be refined, or maybe it's just useless.
I actually kind of liked it. I came up with my own interpretation of it.
Great.
Just thoughts about the circles. We go all the way back to primal man. We saw the circle of the moon, the circle of the sun as it rose and set, the circle in our eyes. There's so many circles in God's creation. The circle of the shape of a tree trunk, a flower. It's circles are everywhere in God's creation. There's also the circles of life. You see the cycles of life. So it's just a beautiful concept on every level.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I started to appreciate what he was saying. I forgot your name. Kurt. Maybe it was safer dwelling at that level of the manifestation of God, because it's sort of between us and God, and then we're not in that out of that safety zone of being partners with God. I think you were saying something like that. When we pray, turning to the manifestation, and that might be a safe place to think about being.
People who wrote to Shoghi Effendi asking, how should I pray? Should I pray to the manifestation? Should I pray to God? He basically said the same thing. He basically said, it's better to pray to the manifestation because it's a concrete thing that you know exists. And if you try to pray, to God, you end up praying to whatever your conception of God is, which Abdu'l-Baha has assured us is some form of idolatry, and the Bab has assured us is some form of idolatry. But to underline that, there's a whole tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he describes why it is, in all of his thousands and thousands of tablets, he puts at the head of every tablet, Hovallah. So anyone who's heard a Persian prayer chanted, it always begins Hovallah, which means he is God. And there's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he describes why he says that. And he says he's not just giving a tautology. It's not an equation, God is God. In this case, the he is God. The he in the he is God is the manifestation. And so Abdu'l-Baha begins every tablet with this affirmation that God is the manifestation. Everything you know about God, everything you can direct yourself to that you call God, is really some instantiation of the names and attributes of God, which is present in the incarnation of the Logos, to use the Christian term, of the manifestation. That is the entity with which we have a personal relationship, and which actualizes all of these ideas about ultimate reality.
I would love to hear you give a 3-minute lecture on cosmology.
Oh, God.
And what happened, why did it happen, why do scientists believe that it happened whatever way that they say it happened?
Well, so it's 4:30, and I've got a plane to catch. But a 3-minute lecture on cosmology. Well, there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot in say popular science magazines that make it seem like there's all sorts of things that we know that we really don't know. The latest trends and fashions have been to talk about multiple universes, multiverses, and strings, and a whole host of ideas which are very sexy sounding and very interesting and fascinating, but for which there is as yet not a shred of evidence. There's still, they're interesting ideas for what they're worth, may actually end up being of scientific validity, but but have not yet been tested and have not yet been validated. What has been validated up to the limits of our understanding is that somehow, and no one knows how or why, 13.7 billion years ago, the universe as we know it, originated in what could very inaccurately be described as an explosion or a Big Bang. But through some process as yet unknown, incredibly rapid inflation was triggered that led to the formation of all of the initial generations of elements that eventually coalesced into the stars and planets and galaxies that now inhabit the universe, and of which we are second or third generation already versions of those initial stars, which is why we are here to talk about these things, because otherwise we would only be made of hydrogen and helium, and the fact that our bodies are made of carbon and calcium and phosphorus and all these other trace elements could only have come from previous generations of stars which have already lived and died and spewed their contents into the cosmos. And one of the, I don't know, for me, one of those magical and profound things that we can say about the universe that science has taught us is that we are all star stuff. That our bodies were, at some point, the elements of our bodies, at some point were in the hearts of dying stars. It's just almost too cool to be true, but it's true. And so that much is known, and which is a lot, but we don't know about the origin, and we don't know how. What is the origin? The big question is, what is the origin of the actual laws of physics within which all these things were made possible? And no one has an answer to that. Why these laws and not those laws? Why is the mass of the electron this and not that? Why is the strength of the gravitational force this and not that? It seems maybe that these, to some, that this particular values of these things have somehow been fine-tuned as though by some craftsman or artisan who sort of cooked up the recipe for the universe at the beginning of time and brought it into being. But another possibility, which I think Plotinus would very much agree with, would be that the principle of creation, the creative principle, the one, the primal will, is infinitely generative. Why is it infinitely generative? Because it wants to infinitely be known. The more it can be known and loved, the better. And so it infinitely generates all possibilities, of which this universe is one possibility. The idea of the multiverse, I think, is both fashionable in cosmology and I think has something going for it from the perspective of these spiritual ideas as well. It just starts from a different premise, but the image that arises is the same. That there may well be, in principle, unobservable infinity of other creations and other universes with different configurations of the laws of physics and so forth. Of which this particular universe happens to have this particular configuration because we're here to observe it. Not occupying the same space, but occupying spaces in parallel dimensions or something like that. Again, nobody knows. And nobody knows the ultimate fate. I mean, it seems now that the ultimate fate of the universe, there's two options, basically, fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire, and some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I side with those who favor fire, but if it had it to perish twice, then for this purpose, ice is also nice and would suffice. That's a really bad version of an actual poem. Fire is a nice alternative. I think that I like fire best because the idea of a cyclical universe has a certain neatness to it. But what it looks like is that the universe is going to keep expanding into infinity, and the expansion may actually accelerate to the point that that the atoms themselves will be torn apart by this force of acceleration, which will be more of the ice version of ultimately entropy taking over in the universe, going dark, and then that's it. At least for this corner of the universe. I mean, there may be other universes, or if the Big Bang happened once, why couldn't it have happened an infinite number of times? That's kind of the question that one obviously asks. And there's no reason why there couldn't have been an infinite number of Big Bangs. But you can't say when or where because it's not, not within the space-time framework that we inhabit. So there's a cosmology lecture in 3 minutes. So I really actually do have a plane to catch at 7 o'clock, and so I actually do have to go. Maybe we take one final question. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm still hung up on that quote, and I need some reassurance here. Have I been praying wrong my whole 45-plus years of
No.
being a Baha'i?
No.
And I think the key is in that first sentence, but I'm not exactly sure what it means. And, sometimes I feel like my prayers are definitely answered, maybe not in the way I want them to, but I definitely have felt. So I can't have been praying wrong my whole Baha'i life. So what does that quote mean?
Well, it means I think it means that there are different ways of thinking about this. And for some people, there might be a different way of praying, which is right for them. This is part of, I think, this profoundly unstabling principle of the relativity of religious truth, that there are different spiritual pathways,
But
different
the
ways
first
of relating to the divine.
The first sentence, does it mean, there's a quote where, I'm not sure the context, but Baha'u'llah says, use the prayers of the manifestation because they have the most power. Or maybe Abdu'l-Baha said it. But anyway, so is that what that first sentence means? Or are we supposed to be, that first sentence in the quote,
Which Kurt read, he who worshipeth God through anyone but him. I'm not sure what that means, and because it depends on how you interpret the pronoun. And there's no one around to say
tell me how
authoritatively how to interpret that pronoun. It's up to you how you want to read it. So, on that note, it's up to you how you want to read all of this. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps. And we know he's racing to the we know he's racing to the airport, but we want to send you surrounded by both the love of God and the love of your dear friends here. So if we could say a closing prayer, and I'm going to pick a short and sweet one. Oh God, my beloved, my heart's desire. Is there any remover of difficulties save God? Say, praised be God, he is God. All are his servants, and all abide by his bidding. Say, God sufficeth all things above all things, and nothing in the heavens or in the earth but God sufficeth. Verily, he is in himself the knower, the sustainer, the omnipotent. So know that your presence here this weekend was a very special blessing for Desert Rose Baha'i Institute. And I speak now of everybody that is here, and that you were here because you were supposed to be here. Now, before you leave, everybody except Dr. Phelps, the last thing on our community building list is to break down everything into, not break everything, but break down. So what we will need to do is stack the chairs along the wall, 3 high. I need 2 people who would be willing to wipe the tables, one on either side. There are 2 containers back here. And we can do this in a matter of moments, but not yet. We have a couple of announcements.
The bookstore, treasure chest, and the jewelry is open for another hour, hour and a half. And we have 2 volunteers to help out with the bookstore for about an hour. Anybody could raise their hand on that.
And the other thing is that we have food bagged up that is in the kitchen and available to you for a donation. We have turkey, we have hamburgers, we have carrots. So open the doors and you take care of that back there if you would. Anything else? And you did say the treasure chest would be open as well.